suspect that a lot of you guys probably are working on tangential or similar topics, but maybe looking at it through a different lens. So I'm really excited to get your feedback.
Does anybody know how to get Apple image up on the screen?
Yeah, I don't know. It should be.
Do I have to maybe do something with my display, or?
Let's see.
Let me try. Did I do something? This is not one of my technological strengths.
If you go into the display section under system preferences,
Yeah, that's where I am.
there should be a little box
Same there.
from your displays. That might be.
Yeah, it's not seeing anything. So this is why you don't get lost in the way here.
Put it back again, or if it's set to the
We
time,
we did try that, I think. Is there a?
It's always something.
Is there another computer we can try? Maybe I could get it on Dropbox. And
You want to borrow mine?
do you think yours would be? Try
I
it.
don't know.
Yeah, let's see if it's repeated. No. Oh, maybe. No. Anybody have a PC we can try? No. Oh, she went up. All right, so maybe I can just start yammering here. Well, we'll see what happens with the timing, but I was asked to present this paper on political attitudes and the illusion of understanding. So basically, we've shown a paper that people think that they understand how political policies work, but in fact they don't. And as some downstream consequences. And then what I was hoping to do was also talk about another project I started, which is about resistance to technology and looking at things like genetic modification of food, which might be an issue that a lot of you guys are interested in. I'm not really sure. The thing that binds these different perspectives together is this idea of, I titled the talk, Passion Without Understanding. So this idea that we're really passionate about a lot of different issues, definitely about politics, about things like genetic modification and stuff like that. But it turns out that people don't really know very much about this stuff at all. They don't know involved. So that presents to me a psychological puzzle about how is this possible? Why is it that we have such passion about these things without really understanding very much about how they work?
Maybe.
How did I do?
There for a second.
How's my improvisational abilities there?
Good.
Oh no, not one way.
Is it a connector issue?
I think it is. I think this cord is unusually touchy. We should probably replace it at some point.
Yeah, okay, cool.
I'll just stand there holding it.
Okay. Now what?
So I think if you just select the 1280 by 1024 if you can. Oh, why is it not?
Sometimes it's like, that's weird. Yeah. I don't know
Here
why
it
it does
goes.
that.
It's there.
Okay. All right.
Oh,
Okay, so that was a bit late in. So passion without understanding. So this idea that we feel really passionate about a lot of things, yet we don't really understand them very well. I'm going to implicate two psychological phenomena or processes that I think might be relevant, and I'll provide some evidence for that. And feel free, like I said, to stop me. I guess you guys are sort of a group that likes to interact during the talk, and I'm perfectly happy to do that. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples of this passion without understanding idea. So everyone's crazy about healthcare these days. That's what's been everything on the news lately. This is a Pew survey that was done in 2012, right after the Supreme Court voted to uphold the Affordable Care Act. And they asked people, do you approve or disapprove of the decision the Supreme Court made? And 76% of people had an opinion. And then if you ask people what they actually ruled, only 55% of people actually knew what they ruled. And even if you combine the people who got this question wrong with the people who got it right, more people here said they had no idea what the Supreme Court ruled and actually had an opinion about what they ruled. This is not specific to just Supreme Court rulings and stuff. I'll show you guys some experiments later, but one of the things we asked about is single-payer healthcare, which people have really strong opinions about, but almost nobody knows what it is. I mean, they sort of can give you a couple of buzzwords, but they don't really have a deep understanding of how it works in any way, shape, or form. This is a chart of voting records in the Senate, and the main takeaway from this chart is these are voting records of Republicans, these are voting records of Democrats, and what you see is this incredible polarization that's going on in the U.S. Senate. I would argue that that's indicative of what's going on in the country in general. We are becoming more polarized on a lot of these issues. Now, are we becoming polarized because we're becoming more informed about these issues and getting stronger and stronger opinions about what we think the implications of these policies are going to be? Well, I don't think so. These policies are actually getting more complex. They're getting more nuanced. They're having more moving pieces. The actual outcomes that are going to be responsible from these policies are harder to predict, even by experts. So we're extremely passionate about politics. In the land of GMOs, this is an example that I really love. This is golden rice. Have you guys heard of this, golden rice? Yeah, probably. You guys know more about this than I do. This is a genetically modified rice that produces vitamin A, which could potentially be a really great thing for a lot of starving children out there who are going blind from vitamin A deficiency. And then a few months ago, you guys might have been familiar with this. I think this is a really evocative picture. This is an environmental group which is tearing up these test fields. So they experimental fields that were planted to test the efficacy of this genetically modified rice. And they planted a small number of these fields, and then these guys decided to tear up the field. They're very passionate about their opposition to GMO. They think that if this is introduced, it's going to be really, really bad consequences. This is one last example that I really love. There was a great article in the New York Times about this a few months ago. Did you guys see this? This is called citrus greening. And this is a disease that is killing citrus crops throughout the world. And basically, I don't know the extent of this is true, but the article implied that if they don't do something about this, we'll have no oranges in 5 or 10 years. It's pretty scary stuff. So the owner of the largest citrus producer in Florida is madly trying all sorts of stuff to come up with some kind of variety of orange that's resistant to this citrus greening. And they use the normal sort of crossbreeding techniques and stuff like that, and then they started getting into the genetic modification stuff. And what's really struck me about that article was that what was once a technology problem has turned into a marketing problem. So they were able to fix this issue. And they fixed it by putting a pig gene into the orange. And the guy said, this is a lost cause. No one's ever going to eat an orange with a pig gene in it. Right? But a spinach gene is okay. So they spent another 2 years, and they got a spinach gene in there. People don't love a spinach gene in an orange, but it's better than a pig gene. Which is, to me, it's an interesting psychological problem. In the marketing literature, there's a little bit of literature about resistance to technology, but it tends to be stuff like, why do we not like complex cell phones and things like that? Whereas to me, this is sort of the most important issue of our time, or one of them, because we're just at the, as you guys I'm sure all know, we're just at the cusp of this stuff, synthetic biology, all that kind of stuff is really going to change the world. And these things become marketing problems, essentially. How can we sort of get over this resistance to these welfare-enhancing technologies that, by all expert determinations, are safe? I just want to make this point that So, people are crazy about GMOs and everything. This is just one data point from this most famous scientific literacy survey. Only 47% of people get this question right, which is pretty amazing. So, you want to bet that people don't know how genetic engineering works and what it really is. There you go. I'll show some more data like this. So let me I'm going to try to cover two things. We'll see how we're doing on time. The first one is, I'm going to implicate two things here. One is this illusion of understanding. This illusion of understanding is that our initial sense is that we understand things better than we do, and that sometimes stops us from looking deeper at stuff. We say, oh, I get it. That's fine. And I'm going to explore that in the domain of political attitudes towards important public policies. And then at the end, I'll go into this other side of it, which is actually this idea that we have false beliefs about how certain kinds of things work. And those kind of false beliefs, I call them mental models. It's unclear in some cases where they actually, if they're developed enough to actually qualify as what you might call a mental model. But people do have certain kind of implicit beliefs about technologies that might not actually reflect the way the technology actually works. They might reflect their beliefs about how they know some other kind of things works, and then they just overgeneralize that to the domain of this new technology, and that makes them scared of certain kind of outcomes that actually don't make any sense if you understand anything about the technology. So the illusion of understanding, it's sometimes called the illusion of explanatory depth in the psychological literature. It's this phenomenon that was documented in the early 2000s. And it was documented in studying things like toilets or ballpoint pens. Things like everyday objects that we interact with all the time. And the basic idea is that if I ask you, do you know how a toilet works? And you don't think about it too hard, you just sort of give your initial intuition, your initial impression of how it works. You'll tell me that you think that you know something about how it works. You know how it works pretty well. And people differ in terms of the exact extent of how much that initial intuition is, but the evidence suggests that it looks something like this, quite a bit, quite a sophisticated kind of thing. And this applies to a lot of different sort of everyday machines or artifacts that we interact with. But then if you ask people to actually explain how it works, at first you ask them, do you know how it works? And then you ask them to explain how it works. Well, this is what happens. People don't really know much at all. And this is a really strong effect. This is a really robust effect. And we find this every time we look for it. And people can give you very, very little in the way of explanation of mechanisms of how things work. And yet that initial intuition is pretty strong. That initial intuition is, oh yeah, I get that. So in terms of public policy, the insight that we had was that a lot of the public policy issues that we're thinking about and we're arguing about in this country are also these causal systems. They're a very different kind of causal system, but they're a system where we're trying to predict some consequence or some outcome based on a bunch of moving pieces that all interact with each other in complex ways. And so in some ways, they are kind of like a toilet or a ballpoint pen. So maybe this same sort of illusion of explanatory depth, illusion of understanding, applies to public policies. If you're wondering what this is, I just looked up on Google Images, I looked up a causal diagram of a social policy. And this is what I turned up. This is from an academic paper. They actually tried to figure out how urban shrinkage works. And the point here isn't to try to interpret all of these arrows, just to note that there's a lot of them. And they all point to each other, and there's cyclic causation, all kinds of stuff. And you can imagine that as a public policy maker, if you were to try to design an intervention and say, oh, okay, let's change this, I mean, it's pretty darn hard to predict exactly what's going to happen, exactly what the outcomes are. And so our leaders who are telling us that we do X, Y will obtain, we do Y, Z will obtain. I mean, it's just not credible for a lot of these kind of issues that we're really talking about these days, like tax changes and all that kind of stuff. So these things are really complex causal systems. So we reasoned that we might get similar kinds of effects. So the first thing I'll show you, we looked at a bunch of different issues. These are the issues that we've used in this. The thing to note about these issues is that they're what we call consequentialist issues, or we tried to pick ones that were consequentialist in the sense that what should determine your attitude towards this is what you hope that the consequences would be. And most of us agree, for instance, if we impose sanctions on Iran or don't, are we decreasing the probability that they'll develop nuclear weapons or something like that? There are other kinds of issues which might not matter whether you understand them or not, or feel like you understand them, things like gay marriage or abortion, things like that, which are more values-based. So it doesn't really matter necessarily if I know how the implications of gay marriage. It might, but it might not if I just think it's wrong because of my religion or something like that. So we try to pick these consequentialist kind of issues. So what we did was we asked people to rate their position on these issues. Okay? Then we asked them to rate their understanding using this method that's been developed in the psychological literature. And then we asked them to try to explain. And we asked them for a particular kind of explanation that's really important. We asked them for this causal mechanistic explanation. I'll show you in a second what that means. And I'll explain in a bit why we think that that's important. And then we asked them to re-rate their understanding, their position, and their certainty as well. We also, I don't know how many of you guys are sort of knowledgeable about psychological methods or designs or whatever. This is a within subjects design where we asked people the same question twice. We also included it within the same study between subjects design where one group only answered after they had tried to explain, and then we can compare that to the other group's pre-explanation judgments. And the basic idea behind that, the reason we want to do that is because you might worry that people might not actually change their positions, but they might just feel obligated to say that their position is lower than when they started because they gave a bad explanation or something like that. So the between subjects comparison is important because it shows that this really is a change, a serious change in their position. Here's the explanation instructions. Please describe all the details you know about the impact of instituting a cap-and-trade system for carbon emissions, going from the first step to the last and providing the causal connection between the steps. That is, your explanation should say precisely how each step causes the next in one continuous chain from start to finish. So the idea is we ask them to set out those causal steps, okay? And that's very similar to what people have shown this illusion in the domain of these everyday artifacts. In study 2, I'll show you why the type of explanation is important. Here is, these are very simple charts. I think the results here are pretty straightforward. We get, this is their pre-explanation understanding, this is their post-explanation understanding, this is the within subjects comparison. So we are in fact replicating this illusion of explanatory depth phenomenon now in the domain of political attitudes. And then same thing with the between subjects comparison. And then this is what's new. So the important thing to notice here is that with these everyday artifacts, toilets, and stuff like that, the implications for the fact that we don't really understand them as well as we thought we did, it might not be that important. But for political policies, we reason that if people realize they don't understand these things as well as they thought they would, maybe they'll moderate their positions because they'll realize, wait a second, this strong, passionate position that I held before actually isn't justified by my level of knowledge. And that's why we think that this is important. And that's precisely what we find. So their position also, actually, so this is the extremity of their position. So this is just the absolute value of how extreme they are on that 7-point scale, going away from the midpoint. And that level of extremity decreases after they try to explain. Now, for any of you guys who are interested in statistical mediation, I don't know, I guess some of you guys might know something about that if you use survey methods and stuff. Basically, it's a way of mapping out the correlations, and it provides some weak evidence for causality. But basically what we find is that the decrease in understanding leads to uncertainty. It's correlated with uncertainty about your position, and that is correlated, negatively correlated with your extremity. So the interpretation of this negative relationship between your decrease in understanding and the extremity of your position after understanding is that because it makes you less certain. But the main thing to notice here is just that that decreasing understanding correlates with decreasing extremity. So the more people are decreasing, feeling that illusion of explanatory depth, that illusion of understanding, the more they're moderating their positions. Okay? Any questions so far? Are we all pretty clear? I think this is pretty straightforward. Okay. Now, if you're a psychology buff, one question you might be asking is, well, wow, that's really surprising, because if you look at the literature on attitude formation in the psychology literature going back to the 60s and 70s, it's really very rare for people to moderate when they engage in any kind of task, any kind of deliberation. Typically, people often get more extreme in their positions, and there's been a lot of studies where people are asked to justify their beliefs, and then after justification, they actually become more extreme in their beliefs. So we said, wow, okay, this result that we have really stands in contrast to that really large body of literature showing that people tend to polarize in their attitudes after deliberating. And we asked the question, why is this mechanistic explanation special? And the answer that we came up with is that if you're justifying a position or providing reasons for a position, it's pretty easy to skim a reason off the top without really digging deeper. So just for an example, cap and trade. Why do you oppose cap and trade? Well, because I think it would be bad for the environment, right? You could provide that reason and not really realize you don't even know how cap and trade works in a very deep way. Mechanistic explanation, the fact that we're forcing you to put those pieces together and say how this thing works, forces you to confront that ignorance. And so that's why we think it might be important. So in this study, what we did was we replicated the first study, and we just added a condition where instead of asking for a mechanistic explanation, we asked people to generate reasons for their position, and we tried to make the task as rigorous as the other task, which was pretty rigorous. So we gave these instructions, which is, write down all the reasons you have for your position, going from the first reason or the most important to the least. Excuse me. And typically people don't generate a huge number of reasons, but it's sort of similar in terms of the amount of content they generate for the mechanistic explanation. So here are the results for the change in understanding. Now we've got pre-explanation, post-explanation. This just exactly replicates study 1. So we find again that we are getting the change in understanding when people are asked to mechanistically explain. But when they're asked instead to generate reasons, the change is much, much smaller. There's actually a small change there. This is actually slightly significant. It's actually mostly due to people who said, oh wait, I have no reason for my position. So people who actually did generate reasons, sometimes they get more extreme, sometimes sometimes their understanding increases, sometimes it decreases. On the whole, it kind of washes out. Here's change in position. Now for mechanism, we replicate the original effect. Again, people are getting more moderate after generating mechanistic explanations, but when they're asked to generate reasons, they don't change at all. Okay? Some people get more extreme, some people get a little less extreme, but on the whole, they don't change. And this is a pattern that we find all the time. It's because people are skimming those reasons. They don't actually have to confront the fact that they don't know. Let me just keep an eye on how much time. What time is it? Is that about? Oh, it's right there? Okay. Maybe we'll do it. Okay. I'll show you 2 more studies. This first study is a decision-making experiment. So one thing that you might ask, it's a common thing to worry about in psychology, is, okay, we've shown that people are now saying, oh, I'm more moderate. Well, does that really mean anything? Is that just, just what they're saying, or would they be willing to put their money where their mouth is? Is this actually going to predict downstream behavior? And that's what we looked at in this study. So we did a very similar kind of experiment. This time they state their position, and then we have them give mechanism, explanation, or reasons for their position. And then we gave them a bonus payment, and we asked them, do you want to donate this bonus payment to an advocacy group that advocates in favor of your stated position? The thinking is that the more extreme you are in your position, the more likely you are to donate. So if I've tried to explain and failed and I become more moderate, maybe I'll be less likely to donate. And that would indicate that this isn't just what they're saying, but actually predicts the downstream behavior. And that's precisely what we find. So what you see here is this is the likelihood of donating on the y-axis, and then here is their pre-decision extremity. So this is I'm sorry, that's a pre-explanation extremity. So, so before I generate reasons or explain how strongly I feel about this issue. Now, if they generate reasons, what you see is that the more extreme they were to start, the more likely they are to donate. And that makes perfect sense, right? That's exactly what you would expect if your manipulation had sort of no effect on people. The more extreme I feel about it, the more likely I am to donate. So that's consistent with what we found before, where reasons really isn't changing their positions or their sense of understanding. Right? But then in the mechanism condition, the condition where we ask people to explain their position, we find a completely different pattern. So now the line is completely flat. And now you have no difference for those people who had really no position to begin with, which makes a lot of sense, but you have this big difference for those really extreme people. So those really extreme people who start off as saying, I really favor cap and trade or flat tax or whatever it is, or really against it, you ask them to try to explain their position, and then they're no longer willing to donate to an advocacy group. I'm going to show you one more study, and then there's sort of a postscript to this study. One question we asked, and we've been doing a lot of follow-on work with this. I'm just giving you guys sort of a taste of what we've been doing. But one question we asked is, we started working on this, we got this grant on what's called intellectual humility. And the idea is, what does intellectual humility mean, and what does it mean to be intellectually humble, et cetera. And so we asked the question about whether this exercise of explaining mechanistically is just leading to these very local changes, and they're going, oh, I don't know about that issue, but I still feel like I know all these other issues, or is it leading to a more sort of general humbling of people's attitudes? I'm going to show you one study that starts to get at it a little bit, and it's a very simple extension of what we've done before. We're going to replicate the same paradigm, but now instead of just asking people to tell us how they feel about the issue that they tried to explain, we're going to ask them about all of the issues that they rated before, and then see what happens to their ratings of those other issues. And then another question you might ask is, okay, say that people become more humble about all of these political issues. Well, are they humble about other stuff as well? More humble about other stuff and more uncertain about other stuff? And there's a variety of different questions you could ask about across domains versus within domains, et cetera. What we wanted to ask in this thing was, are people just becoming completely uncertain about everything? So we asked people to rate their preferences for movies. And the idea would be that if they're just becoming completely uncertain about everything, maybe their opinions about those movies actually becomes more moderate as well. And that would be like they're becoming completely diffident, which isn't necessarily a good thing. And we thought that would sort of be less interesting than finding that this applies not totally specifically to the issue they explained, but a little more generally than that. So just for fun, these are the movies we asked them to rate. We just asked them a 7-point scale, which one is better? So which one do you guys think is better? Which one do you guys think subjects thought was better? Godfather, one on that one. And on this one, what do you guys think? These were exactly the same. And then this one, these were exactly the same as well. I don't know, that's just kind of fun. So the idea is that they rate these on a 7-point scale that goes from this one to this one, and then later when we say how extreme they are, we'll ask them again later and see whether they've shifted towards the middle of the scale. It would be kind of funny if they did. We weren't really expecting that to happen, but it is sort of like the most extreme comparison we can have to understand whether people are becoming completely diffident. So here are the results. I'm just now showing you understanding change. So I'm showing you post minus pre. Actually, pre minus post, sorry. And what you see is that these are the explained issues, the ones that they explained, and they become, their understanding decreases. So that's just replicating what we showed before. But now the issues that they didn't explain, all those other issues they rated, they also say that they understand those less as well. Okay? And then here's the change in extremity. There's no understanding for movies because we didn't ask about understanding, just the position. And again, we replicate this, and we get it for the unexplained issues, that people become more moderate for those unexplained issues as well. And in fact, this is not a significant contrast, but we have found in some studies some evidence that actually you get even bigger effects for the unexplained and the explained issues. No change from movies, maybe not so surprisingly, but it suggests they're not becoming completely different. The postscript to this study is that the results are more nuanced than this. So if you do this in a between subjects design, you actually do not get the generalization. So we're still trying to work out exactly what's going on with that. So it's a little more of a complex story than this lets on.
That's a question.
Yeah.
How long does it stick?
That's a great question. We know it sticks for at least 10 minutes.
Yeah.
We've been running a couple studies where we've been trying to vary the time course and figure out how long it sticks. And we had some sort of methodological issues in sort of running this across 2 weeks and stuff like that. So the truth is, I don't know the answer to that yet. It's sort of inconclusive, the data. We do have data that shows that 10 minutes later, they're still saying that they're 10 minutes. Is not that good. That's a really important question for sure. Yeah, that's one of the things that we're doing as part of the grant.
Because one of the things we try to do when we teach policy, especially in our graduate program, is to give people skills to this mechanistic understanding. And that's, I don't know if it works.
Right.
As far as getting people to look at issues as policy problems, not as tribal, this is the good guys, the bad guys, only the good guys.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but that's a question I have is, if it sticks, is that an indication that teaching works? Or
Yeah, and that's another thing we've been doing is trying to take this in the world of pedagogy, because pedagogy is like the most obvious implication of that sense of understanding. Every student, everyone who's ever been a student and who's ever tried to explain so knows that you have those little eureka moments that actually don't map onto real understanding. And then the big challenge of teaching is how do you get people to generalize to new situations and stuff like that. So presumably teaching them this deeper mechanistic stuff and getting them to explore in that deeper way will hopefully help them to generalize in that way. But that's really, really hard for people. The hope that I have, and sort of as I've gone through this work, that just catching yourself at that moment of going, oh yeah, I accept that position, that my tribe or my political affiliation has told me is the right one. I probably like most of you, I'm kind of on the left side of the spectrum. And it's like, before I started this work, and I read, Paul Ryan's budget is purposely meant to destroy the lower class and all this stuff. It might be true, but I catch myself at that moment and say, wait, actually, I don't have enough information yet to make that determination. And so I think that hopefully that's what we're fostering in people, but whether that actually sticks, I don't know. We definitely have a lot of stuff looking at some individual difference variables that predicts the extent to which people are susceptible to stuff like this. And the unfortunate thing is that most of the evidence suggests that a lot of people, they might moderate their opinion about like a political issue, but that won't translate to other domains like, their calibration and general knowledge sort of stuff. People are more reflective, more thoughtful, actually, it does. But that's still a question. I saw another hand up there.
Yeah, I don't mean to get further off track with others' question. That's another question. I was curious what population you sampled. Because, were you looking at various socioeconomic status? Were you looking at highly educated people?
Well, a lot of these studies are on Enter. You guys know Enter? It's online pool. And it skews a little more educated than general population, but it's still, sort of computer savvy kind of thing, but it's a pretty good slice. It skews a little more Democrat than Republican as well. But basically what the evidence seems to suggest is that you get similar results as you would if you were to do this with like college undergraduates and stuff like that. And more representative samples, there's been a little bit of comparison of that. Do you have a particular thought about how different demographics might?
Well, I was just curious in
affected,
terms of maybe if you were sampling highly educated folks that might be more willing to question their beliefs, so they might be more certain about it.
Yeah, absolutely. We found that in other work is that there's this psychological test called the cognitive reflection test. Have you guys ever heard of this? It's basically these trick questions where the wrong answer pops into your head. It's like a math problem that has a sort of a lure, a trick answer. And the people who do well on that test, they're the ones who sort of inhibit that initial instinct. and they think more deeply about their answer, they tend to be less susceptible to these kind of effects because they actually think about how much do I know before emitting that response about, oh yeah, I know a lot. There's sort of a debate in the literature, in the, some of you guys might know some of this. I know a lot of you guys study environmental issues, and Dan Kahan is a guy at Yale, whose name you might know. He's published some pretty high-profile papers about environmental policy, and he's been sort of trying to push this idea that smarter people are actually the ones who are more susceptible to effects like this. And I think the story is more complicated than that. I think there's sort of a little bit on both sides, but that's maybe a discussion for another day. I guess I'm rambling at this point.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So are these people that you're testing, they're doing it individually?
Yes.
So there's no interaction?
Yeah, that's another great point. So this is sort of like the most, it's sort of a clunky lab manipulation. They're sitting at a computer. We're asking them this sort of funny question about explaining. And we've thought about whether this is generalizable to more ecological contexts and what type of scenarios would you want to use. And one thing we've thought about is kind of dispute resolution or negotiations kind of context, where you actually have a moderator who could make people sit down and talk through the nuts and bolts. And I think that would probably be a stronger manipulation, I would guess.
There's a study, I think it's a Paul Slovic study, but I may be wrong, but they took people in Colorado Springs and Boulder, and they have talk.
It's a Reed Hasty and David Scotty paper.
And they became more extreme if they talked to people who shared their views.
Yeah, it's called, that's group polarization.
Yeah.
So,
but if they integrated the groups.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
well, if you integrate the groups, I believe that's been done, and I think it's a mess.
Yeah.
But if you integrate the groups and you have a moderator who makes them engage in mechanistic explanation, that's the kind of thing that we've thought about doing in sort of a group polarization context. Yeah, that's sort of a well-known finding, and it's another sort of scary finding about our sort of tribalism, is that we get into these like-minded groups and we push towards the poles. And then the study you're referring to was a great one. Reed Hasty, who was a psychologist who was at Colorado, now in the business school at Chicago, was involved, and he realized that you have Boulder, which is the most liberal place in the country, and you have Colorado Springs, which is the most conservative place in the country. So he just got groups from both of those areas, and then you have a really well-matched sample of conservatives and Democrats. It's really, really nice thing. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about politics. And let me now get into the technology stuff. And this is definitely much more preliminary. So I'm really happy to hear suggestions or comments. I started this work because, like I said, if you look at the literatures in psychology and in marketing and consumer behavior on scientific literacy, technology acceptance, those kind of issues, there's not that much there. There's a few papers, but there's not so much there. So I went and started digging around, and then I found that there's entire journals that are dedicated to just research on trying to understand the relationship between scientific literacy and attitudes towards science and technology and all that kind of stuff. That literature tends to use quite different methodologies than scientific psychological literature. So I think that there's probably a lot of value in bridging those things. And that's what we're starting to do. We're definitely going to have some overlap with what's already been done before in that kind of public understanding of science literature, but I think we come at it hopefully from a perspective that might be a little bit new to you guys. So this will hopefully be a good dialogue. So just saying a few words about that literature. Do you guys all read this journal, Public Understanding of Science? I guess some of you guys probably do. There's a few other journals where this kind of research is published. It's mostly survey-based papers where essentially they do some kind of scientific literacy test. It's usually the same scientific literacy test. And then they ask people about their attitudes towards a variety of scientific issues and technological issues and things like that. There's this idea called the deficit model, which says that, well, this all started with, why are people so resistant to things like nuclear power, which, our experts are all saying is really safe, but people hate it and all this kind of stuff. So what's going on here? And one explanation is, well, people just don't know very much about science, and that makes them scared or resistant to technologies that they don't understand. That's called the deficit model. in the literature, they say that there's sort of mixed evidence for the deficit model. Sometimes you find correlations between knowledge and attitudes, sometimes you don't. And the literature, on my reading, has sort of turned to more of this cultural factors, understanding the sort of tribalist stuff, as opposed to that understanding part of it. The understanding part of it is the thing that I'm more interested in. Dan Kahan is another person who's, on the psychological side, been pushing this culture part of it. And don't get me wrong, that's a huge part of it. I'm not saying that one of these is right or wrong. I think that this is like a hugely multiply determined issue that has a lot of different causes. A couple things to note about this literature. Typically, what they look at is the relationship between some score on scientific literacy and some set of attitudes. That score is just a sum of correct answers to like true, false questions or multiple choice questions. There is some evidence in that literature, and we find this as well, that within domain knowledge predicts within domain attitudes better than this sort of overall relationship between scientific literacy and attitudes. So if I don't know anything about physics, but I know something about genetics, that's going to predict my attitudes towards GMOs better than my overall scientific literacy. There's also some methodological issues. Typically what they do is they just collapse I don't know and incorrect into one bucket, and then correct, and then you just sum those things up in terms of number correct. And I do a lot of work on calibration of people's subjective confidence and their actual level of correctness. And what I know from studying that is that there's a lot of information in how strongly people feel about what they know. And so my intuition as a psychologist was that this sort of coarse measure of just correct, incorrect, especially lumping I don't know and incorrect into one bucket, misses out on a lot of the power of doing this test. So I changed that in the way that we ask the questions, and I'll show you how. And then one last point is that one sort of failure of this deficit model is that if it really is a deficit issue, then if we provide people with knowledge, then they should become less resistant to technology. It's just sort of like, an obvious deduction from premises. It turns out that any study you look at in that literature where they do some kind of knowledge provision manipulation has no effect whatsoever. As a psychologist, I wasn't so surprised by that, because a lot of these knowledge provision manipulations are not very good manipulations. It's like you just give people a bunch of information that they can't integrate, they can't understand, they can't absorb into what they already understand and know. It's not going to have the effect that you would hope that it has. So really, one of the goals of this is to say, how can we design better interventions based on a deeper understanding of the psychology of what's going on? Okay? So one psychological literature that I drew on is this idea of what's called mental models. Have you guys ever heard of this idea of mental models? Some of you guys know this. I guess if you guys are in the education area, you might especially know this, because this is something that's like really critical to things like physics education and stuff. This is just one example. What's a mental model? Well, you can come up with a lot of definitions, but basically it's the stuff that we have, some sort of knowledge that's structured in some way that allows us to make predictions about some kind of domain. There was a lot of really fascinating research on what people's mental models are for various different kinds of systems in like the 70s and 80s, and then it sort of petered out because it's really hard to study. How do you actually figure out what those models are? One area that's been studied a lot, and this is just an example, is physics, so naive physics. People tend to have an impetus theory of physics, so that this leads to things like them predicting that if you spin something around and then release it, it's going to fly off in sort of a curvilinear trajectory. That's because they think that you have some sort of impetus of curving motion that has to dissipate. And that's wrong. But it happens because people abstract their naive physics from what they observe around them. And what they observe around them isn't always consistent with, like, laws of mechanics. Whatever. And that's true across a lot of different domains. So this is a great quote by Don Norman. He said, "People's mental models are apt to be deficient in a number of ways, perhaps including contradictory, erroneous, and unnecessary concepts. As scientists who are interested in studying people's mental models, we must develop appropriate experimental methods and discard our hopes of finding neat, elegant mental models, but instead learn to understand the messy, sloppy, incomplete, and indistinct structures that people actually have. Now, why I got interested in this, I got interested in applying this idea of mental models to this problem of technology acceptance because there's sort of this distinction you can draw where a deficit model is a kind of thing of risky because I just don't know anything. Whereas with mental models, it's risky because I have some implicit mental model or some set of beliefs, and those beliefs are wrong, and they make it seem scary. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that people have like fully fleshed out mental models of genetic engineering or other things in the way that they do have pretty developed naive theory of physics. But they do have some implicit beliefs. They might be really coarse beliefs, they might be really subtle beliefs, but they do have some implicit beliefs, and that might be part of the reason. That's the working hypothesis. That might be part of the reason that people are resistant to these kind of things. We did a couple studies where we tried to just elicit people's mental models about what risks they perceived for these technologies, and it's a bit of a mess. But we focused on two technologies because we thought they were kind of interesting. I'm more interested in this GMO, but we also looked at food irradiation. Do you guys know what food irradiation is? It's this technology where you pass ionizing radiation through foods. It kills a lot of pathogens. It can be really effective. It's perfectly safe according to any tests that have gone on, but it just can't catch on. People do not want irradiated food. They're very scared of it. So we asked people, why are you scared of this kind of stuff? And irradiation, this is a good one for mental models because there's this very clear mental model that a lot of people have that's wrong, which is that radioactivity and radiation are the same thing. Radiation, like light waves are radiation. You pass ionizing radiation through food. It's basically energy. It can't stay in the food. It can't stick in the food. It makes no sense. But that's typically what people think. They have some kind of implicit mental model of kind of contamination, that this radiation goes into the food and then the food kind of is emanating radiation. Radiation Man on The Simpsons or something like that, right?
I feel like that's just an unfortunate naming coincidence there. Your radiation just makes people think.
Yes. Well, it's not. It's not just thinking of the nuclear reactor, but it's thinking of that. Anyway, this is my belief that people have some implicit belief about how radiation works. That it sort of emanates from stuff, and it's in the thing, right? And yes, I think the wording sucks because if you call this. Actually, we have a study where if you call this cold pasteurization, the acceptability way increases. But what is it about that word radiation that does this? I think it's the fact that it brings to mind this mental model of radioactivity. GMO is a lot more diffuse why people are scared of it. Now, a lot of people, I wouldn't call this a mental model, but a lot of people say, well, we just don't know what's going to happen. We're sort of messing with the fabric of the universe, and we don't know what the possible outcomes of this can be. I don't think that, and a lot of people say this, and a lot of really educated people say this. I actually think that it's, at the risk of overstepping the bounds of science, I think that's kind of wrong. People hold that belief for the wrong reason, because if you take, say, an organism that's developed through selective breeding, it's a lot more different in unexpected ways from the parent than is the genetically modified food from the parent, right? Where only typically one gene has changed. We know exactly what protein that gene codes for and stuff like that. So that's sort of just fear of the unknown. I don't think that's, but it's different from having an implicit false belief. But people also do talk about some false beliefs as well. They talk about contamination, and that's one thing I'm going to talk about in the study I'll show you in a second. So some people think that if you consume genetically modified foods, like the DNA can get into your own DNA. That's pretty scary. Makes no sense if you know anything about genes, but people don't even know what a gene is. There's some stuff about also with environmental contamination. So people appeal to fears about the environment, and I don't know that much about that. I'm no expert. Some of that stuff might actually be relatively well-founded. That we should be concerned. Although when they talk about crossbreeding and cross-pollination stuff like that, well, what's different between a genetically modified crop and one that's developed through crossbreeding? I don't know. I'm not sure people could really answer that question. People talk a little bit about out-of-control processes. You guys know the gray goo idea? This is sort of the science fiction version of what happens with nanotechnology, is that things get released and the whole world turns into gray goo. People talk a little bit about that kind of stuff. And then another one is this idea of essentialist belief. So in psychology, this idea that a category has an essence. You might think of that as a set of features that are really central to category membership. And so I gave you guys that example before about the orange. It's like if you tell people that a spinach gene is going into an orange, they think, oh, it's going to like turn green and taste like spinach. Well, spinach has a lot of different features that could potentially be transferred to the orange. Why do we think that the ones that are going to be transferred are the ones that are most central to category membership, like tasting like spinach and being green? Well, it's because we have this sort of essentialist belief that you're transferring part of the essence of one of them to the other one. Okay, just a few more minutes, and then I can hang and answer questions if you guys want to stick around. This is a really simple survey methodology. What I did was I asked people scientific literacy questions, but I put those literacy questions on a 7-point scale from this is definitely false to this is definitely true. And then what we can do is we can look at the extent to which having, like strongly holding false beliefs predicts over and above just like your scientific literacy. The idea that you really like strongly believe the things that are wrong, or strongly believe the things that are right, as opposed to having sort of intermediate beliefs. So you can sort of pit this idea of I don't really know against, oh yeah, I really know and it's scary against each other. Then I ask people to rate acceptability of technologies, risk of technologies, the benefit of technologies, to rate their knowledge about the technologies, and that's kind of interesting. I'll show you what that shows in a second. Their subjective knowledge, and then some demographics. This one's exactly the same, it's just we flipped whether we ask about the attitudes or the scientific literacy first for obvious reasons of contamination. We don't find any effects of order in this study. So asking people the scientific literacy questions first doesn't really change their beliefs, their attitudes. These are the literacy questions. You guys probably recognize some of them. A lot of them come from those science indicators tests. I put in a couple that I put in red here, which I believe should pertain to those specific false beliefs that may give rise to fears about these things. So we can look at whether those particular questions predict people's attitudes towards technology over and above just their scientific literacy. So this is the one about radiation equals radioactivity. And then this is that scary one about a gene inserted into a food can migrate into the genetic code of humans who consume the food. This one is more about that essentialist thing about putting the spinach gene into an orange will make it taste like spinach. Yeah. And then these are the technologies we asked about. I'm just going to talk a little bit about food irradiation and genetically modified foods. These other ones might be interesting. We haven't even thought about them yet. We just wanted to have a bunch in there, and so we picked some from the literature and added a couple as well. One thing that we wanted to look at potentially was incoherence. So one aspect of these mental models is that you can have mental models of the same underlying process that are different from each other because you don't realize that they're the same thing. So we can maybe explore a little bit some of that incoherence by showing that people, they're okay with irradiating medical devices, but they don't want to irradiate food, or they're okay with genetically modified foods. Genetically modifying medicines, but not foods, that kind of thing. But I'm not even going to talk about that unless you guys want to know more about it. Here are the overall percent correct. This is just dichotomized in the same way that, so if they said, probably true, maybe definitely true, etc., all of those would be characterized as correct. All the incorrect answers would be characterized as incorrect. This just shows you the spread of results. I think people do a little bit better on my test than on the science indicator, sort of the national one that they've done every 20 years. That could be because now people have the option to give, and I'm not sure, but I kind of think it's true, response. It could also be the sample that I'm using is a little bit different. One thing just to notice is on these ones that I put in here, they're pretty good items because people, a lot of people actually get them wrong or don't know the answers to them. So they're pretty good items in terms of finding potential effects. Okay, I'm just going to give you guys a couple bullet points on the results. Okay, what this is the overall correlations of scientific literacy to their acceptability, their average acceptability, risk, benefit, and how much they say they know about these technologies. Now, the first thing I did is just dichotomize these responses to the scientific literacy questions in the same way that you would do in literature. Correct, incorrect, and then I think I can't remember if I put I don't know as incorrect or separate. I can't remember. And what you find is no ambiguity here. There's definitely correlations in the direction you'd expect by the deficit model. So these are really strong correlations from a statistical significance perspective for acceptability for risk. Benefits a little bit weaker, but they're definitely there. So there's no doubt that in my data, there are relationships between overall scientific literacy and attitudes toward technology. I think that this is really interesting. It's very consistent with what I found in past work. There's actually no correlation between their scientific literacy and how much they say they know about these technologies. And that's very consistent with what we find in a lot of work, is that people just don't know what they know. People really stink at metacognition about their level of knowledge. So that's part and parcel of the whole thing of I sort of think that I get these things better than I do. Yes.
Okay, so because if we go to generative modified organisms,
Yeah.
I mean, one of the great debates is not practical science.
Yeah.
I mean, that's that too. But what it does for socioeconomic structures, that it makes the big five more powerful and the dependency creates and so on. So how is that reflected in your study? Because I mean, your position on this might be partly based on your scientific understanding, but then there is the whole socioeconomic understanding, and is that all?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Let me finish the slide, get to the next slide, and then I'll return to your question. I just want to point out that we can also, instead of dichotomizing that measure, take a continuous measure. So that means that if I got it right and I said, I'm sure it's right, that's 3 points. If I got it wrong, but I said, I'm sure it's wrong, that's negative 3 points, right? And we just add all those up. All of a sudden, you get hugely larger correlations. So there's a lot of signal in that level of confidence about people's knowledge. And now we just have these overwhelmingly large correlations that I think these are sort of indisputable. Now the subjective knowledge becomes significant, but it's still much weaker than these other correlations. So these things really predict well your attitudes towards technology. Now, what about specific false beliefs? Well, that also turns out to be the case, that specific false beliefs are predicting attitudes towards specific technologies. I'm going to return to your question in just 1 second. This is the question about this scary one about the gene migrating into the genetic code of the humans who consume the food. Now, people who get that wrong, those guys are the ones who are really, really against GMO. And then what you see is almost a perfect line. So your attitude towards this is really, really well predicted by your response to that particular question. So if you feel that that's true, then your attitude towards that is true. Now, what you notice over here is that this does not go down to 0. And I think that this is part of your question. There's definitely a lot of unexplained variance in why people don't like GMOs. So even people who know that this definitely isn't true, the people who are for our sample are relatively knowledgeable about this stuff, they don't say, yay, GMOs are great. They do have reservations. And part of those might have to do with other issues about the socioeconomic stuff and things like that.
But that doesn't enter into your test. I mean, you don't ask those questions.
We didn't ask questions about that. My suspicion is that you get similar kind of effects where people overestimate their understanding of those kind of socioeconomic issues as well. And so we get a lot of stuff like, oh, I'm against this because Monsanto is evil corporation. And that's sort of something that might be relevant, but they don't really know what Monsanto does and things like that. So I totally agree that there might, I don't know if this was the import of your point, that there may be good reasons for opposing GMOs. And I'm not an expert on the science, but what I can say is that a lot of people, part of their opposition to GMO is not reasonable. It's based on these false beliefs.
But I mean, I was more, because we have a problem with the deficit model in climate policy.
Right.
But just more explanations on how the climate works doesn't change people's behavior. So,
right.
And that's another part. But the next step, perhaps, in your study is not just your attitude, how that changes to your understanding, but also does it really change your behavior or what you would choose? If you pick GMO as an example, would it influence what you select?
Absolutely.
Identify in the store, and that's where the deficit model perhaps gets into trouble.
Right.
It really doesn't affect our behavior. It can
and make that short-term kind of outcomes. Yeah, and look, as somebody in a business school who's trying to make claims about consumer behavior, absolutely you want to, like, the dependent measure that people care about is what that downstream behavior is. And there is sort of dissipation. You have some kind of manipulation that's going to affect the attitude. It can only affect the behavior less than it affects the attitude. So you can have some dissipation to the effect. So the question is, what can we do to try to get as big of a whopping effect as we can that hopefully will trickle down and change the behavior a little bit? That's a little different from, I think, part of your initial question is that there might be a variety of different reasons why people are opposed that go beyond just understanding the science. And I think that that's right as well. So that takes me to my last slide, this just one other point that if you control for overall scientific literacy and just look at the partial correlation between their specific false beliefs and their attitudes, that's still highly significant. So there's something about having these specific false beliefs that's driving these attitudes. This is my summary slide, but the last point is exactly on this issue is, okay, I'm hopefully learning something about what's going on here. But what we're learning is that these things are going to be hard to change. I mean, people have these very deep-seated beliefs. That's what's special about mental models, is that they're pretty deep in there. We don't even know that we have them sometimes. And so you can't just tell people, oh, you're wrong about that. That doesn't work. You have to do something better. You have to give them an analogy by which they can understand the correct model and understand why it's not scary or something like that. So that's the kind of things that we're exploring, would be interventions that are a little bit more targeted at these psychological processes that we're understanding a little bit from this research, which would be, the first one I talked about, the illusion of understanding. Get people to realize they don't know as much as they thought they do. Maybe they become more open to stuff when they moderate a little bit. And then get people to understand that some of the fears that they have can't possibly arise. And then maybe they'll shift to a different fear or something just because they don't want to like this thing. But people tend to be fairly reasonable. If they realize that what they're saying is not possibly the case according to a model that they can understand, they do tend to moderate a little bit. So that's what I'm hoping is sort of the end point of this research. So I guess I'll stop there, and I can hang around for a few minutes if you guys want to talk anymore. Thank you. Thanks for having me. If you guys want to download any papers, you can go to my website.
Oh, excellent. Anyone who wants to head out because we are over time?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
We're past the point.
Over time. I started.
Unacceptable. Maybe I'll ask a question.
Sure.
That's about the directional causality and your correlations. Because one of the criticisms of the public understanding of science, the deficit model, is that people might say, well, GMOs are evil. Therefore, they must have these traits. Not they have these traits, therefore I conclude that they're evil.
I see.
That people in their mental models come to the political conclusion first, and then seek out rationalizations or justifications
based on what their tribe says.
Or what they'd like it to be the case. And if you say, well, actually, no, the pig gene doesn't show up, your nose doesn't change shape, they'll say, oh yeah, well, but they do this. And that people are very easily, they'll pick and choose among.
Yeah, I think there is that's definitely a concern. Is that if you show them that some plank of their sort of platform in which they're opposing this thing is wrong, they'll find another plank to shift to. But my hope would be that their platform is a little more wobbly.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good extended metaphor I came up with. So you keep taking out planks, essentially, would be the idea. I think that, yeah, so one thing is that if these truly are mental models, from a causal perspective, in some sense, they have to come first. Because there's sort of these very deep beliefs about things. Other sort of reasons that don't rise to the level of mental models, like Monsanto is an evil company, because you read it on Facebook and your friend said it on Facebook or whatever. Yeah, I definitely agree. People, so Leif Van Boven is another guy. Maybe you guys should invite him in here as well. He's been doing research in the psych department about polarization, and he finds that the huge determinant of what position people take on is what their group says. So if you think cap and trade is a Republican policy and you're a Republican, you love it. So people definitely engage in that kind of stuff. But with this kind of scientific understanding, I think that I'm pretty convinced at this point that part of it is these implicit false beliefs that we have. We just think that these new technologies seem scary. GMOs seem scary. It seems like unnatural, so people have those kind of fears, but also the consequences feel kind of scary. Like this seems like we're playing with something that we shouldn't be playing with. Does that answer the question?
It does. This comes up a lot in our discussion. Here's a trivia point you can take with you. So Boulder, I think, has the second most PhDs per capita in Lane County. Cambridge is first, and we also have the largest incidence of non-vaccination.
Yeah.
So it's hard to correlate scientific understanding with actions.
Yeah, but that's why that sort of specificity of the belief is important. Because I think that, in fact, people don't vaccinate because they've got some false beliefs about the dangers of vaccination. And that's why I'm picking on GMOs so much. That's why I love it. That's such a good topic. Because it's easy to pick on these, well, I think vaccination is pretty crazy, pretty fringy. But GMO is something that, like, my mom and her friends are like, hate GMO. They're super educated people. And I run into this all the time, is really educated people being really opposed to this stuff. And it's sort of driving me nuts a little bit at this point, because the more I read about it, the more I sort of see the benefits, and I see like no justification that people are giving.
Funded by Unilever. You had a correlation there?
Does Unilever use GMOs? Yeah, I guess they don't. They don't really do many foods. Oh, ice cream. Is it GMOs and vegetables? I'm sure. Well, they should be. I mean, we can't feed half the planet if we don't have GMOs. So I think that it's fine to be opposed to it.
I don't disagree with you totally, but I think that is a false belief.
Is it?
Okay. I think we could definitely feed the planet without GMOs. But then, if it's beneficial or not to do it, and what consequences that would have for our lives, that's the tricky question.
That's a good one. So I always say things, and then I have to learn more about them. Which is why it's fun to come over here. You guys probably know more about this stuff than I do.
I don't know that, but so on one hand, the model you showed of like polarization of the Senate over time, I kind of think reflects this notion that we've started to emphasize the role of science and policymaking more heavily than sort of moral or aesthetic principles that underlie a lot of these beliefs. And so I'm curious as to what sort of moral or aesthetic questions or drivers you've incorporated in your models. Because on one hand, it seems like there are experts on either side that can be enlisted and pulled into the sort of political discussion as if they know the answer, as if there's one answer. And in particular with the case of GMOs, it's like public objection, despite this sort of expert endorsement, I think probably reflects more of their moral and aesthetic judgments about GMOs rather than like the science underlying it. And I don't know if we should necessarily take this position that if they only knew more about it, then they would adopt certain attitudes towards it.
So I think what you're saying, and it's funny how like across the field we use like a little bit of different language. When you say moral and aesthetic versus, what was the other one? Scientific. Yeah, in psychology, in moral psychology and stuff like that, there's a similar distinction which is between deontology and consequentialism, or they describe it in different kind of ways. And your question is essentially about how much of a role each of those factors play in this. And I definitely believe there's both going on. So there's people who are opposed to GMO because they think it's just wrong to sort of play God, whatever. But I think
They
our
find science
data,
to support that position.
oh, I see. Okay, but then they find science to support it. Yeah, I think our data are showing that at least part of the thing is about the consequences. So they're not just inherently opposed to these things, but they think that the consequences of these things are going to be bad. And in fact, I'm planning a new study right now, and that's exactly one of the questions that we want to figure out, is to get basically, to try to quantify the proportions of people who have values-based or deontological or, as you say, moral or aesthetic objections to technologies as opposed to sort of consequentialist ones. And it probably varies by technology, but if you think about something like food or radiation, I mean, would you think that that would be something that people would oppose on moral grounds or on more sort of consequentialist scientific grounds?
Well, I mean, I would classify consequentialism and deontology as both two different branches of moral beliefs, and like, to accept the notion that consequences are objectionable or praiseworthy is a consequentialist approach within morality. And so you can say on one hand, like, maybe people are being consequentialists when, in fact, or they're acting and they're justifying as if they're consequentialists, but in fact they're deontologists because they believe.
Yeah, right. In moral psychology, there's two sort of ways. I guess what I meant was, so I'm not. Yeah. I confused it by talking about like the two justifications of moral psychology. But I guess my point is that yes, there are going to be moral implications of the consequences. But what I'm really trying to distinguish, I think the important distinguish thing is whether you have the opportunity to change someone's beliefs or not. And if they have a moral objection to something, or a sort of deontological objection to something, it's very hard. If they have a consequentialist objection to something, and they're wrong about the consequences, I believe you can change it. And so that's where I think that the line should be drawn, not necessarily between this sort of more broader definition of morality, where you would count, this thing is going to feed people, but it's also going to, kill this many people and stuff like that. You could cash that out as utility maximization without having to appeal to like basic moral principles. So that sort of basic moral principles side of it versus appealing to consequences side. That's where I would draw the distinction, draw the line. Was that a useful answer?
Yeah, I think so.
I think it's a deep question. I could talk more about it with you.
But how do you effectively implement these sort of interventions, because they involve a lot of nuance and complications? How do you compete with, like, say, some guy on Fox News who says tax credits kill jobs, or Obamacare kills jobs? Like, how do you compete with the simplicity of that sort of echo chamber?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really tough question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I guess the idea is that you're always going to have a lot of different levers pushing people. And unfortunately, in our society, in our sort of psychological makeup, most of those levers push towards the direction of polarization, for a million different reasons. And if we can put in a couple of them that push in the opposite direction, and we can just get a sort of an ethos among people of questioning, before engaging in that sort of substantive argumentation, I believe X, I believe Y, my party says X, my party says Y. If people sort of get in the habit of saying, oh, wait a second, do we know how that works? Just getting them to stop and pause will help. But you're right, it's definitely fighting an uphill battle. I think that's why people get excited about this work, is because there is so many things pushing in the wrong direction. What little levers can we push here and there to try to push people in the right direction? And with the scientific stuff, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is trying to figure out more powerful interventions that can help. And maybe the constituencies aren't quite as strong as the political parties. They're still pretty strong, I guess, but maybe there's people aren't as tied, hopefully, to like one camp or the other when it comes to accepting technologies, but I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, guys. Appreciate it.